I'm quite happy to take abuse.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Stuart Welsh.
Hello, Kieran, and thanks for having me back.
It's great to have you back, Stuart. Now, this week, we're going to explore leading from the middle. But first, Stuart, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
Well, Kieran, at the moment I'm reading an article called Feed Up, Back, Forward, which is written by Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey. So I think we all know that feedback is a good thing and something that we should be doing, but it's easy to get it wrong, and are we making the most of it? So I've just been having a bit of a think about that, and I'm probably guilty of thinking that feedback is something that generally happens after students have produced a piece of work. And I maybe haven't given enough thought to how we can sort of set the scene and create the optimal conditions for feedback to be really effective. So in this article, Fisher and Frey are talking about feeding up, feeding back, and feeding forwards. And these were actually kind of new terms for me. So I wanted to sort of find out a bit more about what they meant. And Fisher and Frey argue that feedback, and probably most of us are in the same boat here, we think that feedback is just, students do some work, we give them some pointers about how to improve it. They argue that it's only one part of the sort of effective feedback process. And what we should really be doing is setting clear learning goals, and also letting assessment data influence our instruction. So feeding up involves, really clarifying the learning goals, emphasizing that when we're clear on the objective, then we're able to design tasks and we're able to give feedback that really supports learning because it's tied to this very clear original definition. And then feedback, as we kind of know, revolves around teachers' responses to student work, giving them information about their progress towards that goal and suggesting kind of actions that they could take to improve. And then that final component, feed forward, which is really interesting for me, emphasizes the importance of modifying our instruction based on any assessment data that we've sort of brought in. So, I talk about responsive teaching, and I talk about a sort of interplay between planning and teaching and assessing. And then this kind of ties into it for me as well. It resonates with this idea of responsive teaching and using assessment data not only to provide feedback to students, but also kind of to provide feedback to ourselves in the sense that we can then modify our instruction accordingly.
I mean, that's really, really interesting. Lots of people talk to me about this idea of the decisions we make in the classroom. And feedback's one of those ones where you think you've got it sussed, and then you read something else. Normally Dylan William shares something, you're like, oh, no, I haven't. So, I mean, I think people will be really interested in that paper. I have been reading a paper called 5 Principles for Inclusion. It's by Tom Rees and Ben Newmark. And essentially it sets out I don't know if it's their position, but they're certainly contributing to the conversation on SEND. It's a really, really powerful, clear, really, really effective, I think, in getting the message across and in proposing alternatives to the current system within the context of what schools are experiencing right now, if that makes sense. So I think anyone who hasn't read it yet really should, because it's a very important piece, I think. So Stuart, you've been on the podcast before, but I'm just realizing this is your first time in a sort of one-on-one, not in a one-to-many situation. Would you like to introduce yourself and let everyone know who you are, where you're from?
Yeah, Kieran, absolutely delighted to do that. I think last time I was on, we're kind of part of a panel. Some really great discussion went on there, and it was great to be involved in that. So, my name's Stuart Welsh. I have been in maths education for 17 years, roughly. I started as a mathematics teacher in Glasgow, moved on through a couple of schools in Glasgow to become head of maths department there. And latterly, I moved to Spain, south coast of Spain, worked in an international school where it was really good to get experience of sort of different curricula, the IB in particular. And then Following that, I moved to work for Complete Mathematics, who gave me the opportunity to work with a lot of schools, school groups and teachers in terms of improving their pedagogy, improving their teaching and learning. Even more recently, I have co-founded, along with your good self, a company called Alta Education, where we're focusing on providing schools and school groups with research-based professional learning and high-quality curriculum resources. So I spend a lot of time thinking about education. I don't know how deeply, but hopefully today we think quite deeply about middle leadership, which is something that I've been talking about increasingly more often. And I find that it's such a critical part of the school structure and such a key role, and that a lot of people who are in a middle leadership role, I think, are really looking for some support and some advice. So hopefully we can get to those things today.
And it's great to have you here. I mean, it's probably an oversight on my part that you haven't been on more regularly.
I do talk with you every day, Kieran, so we don't need a podcast, we don't need an audience.
Also, you have to earn your brownie points by listening more regularly, I think, because So, I mean, you started to mention middle leadership. This episode's all about leading from the middle. What do we mean when we say middle leaders?
It's a good question, actually. It's important probably to clarify that, because it can seem quite obvious. For me, anyway, a middle leader is somebody that plays a crucial role in educational leadership, but usually that's within a subject area. It's regardless of phase, so primary or secondary. We're talking about maths leads, people with additional responsibility for mathematics in some form or another, heads of department or principal teachers, or even faculty heads, depending on the system. These are the people that are responsible for guiding colleagues and for ensuring the sort of effective implementation of strategies that are maybe being determined by senior leadership, and strategies that contribute to the overall aim of the school. Often I find that these people in the middle leadership role were good, possibly excellent classroom teachers, very hardworking people, probably very organized people. And then often the case seems to be that they find themselves in some sort of middle leadership role. So they've been promoted because they're good, essentially. But just because you're a really highly effective classroom teacher doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a great leader. If you're hardworking, it's probably going to help. If you're organized, it's probably going to help. But I often ask the question, how many years does it take to become even a pretty good teacher? Nobody's a finished article. We're all still on that journey of sort of improvement, but there becomes a point, maybe for me, 5 or 6 years, and Kieran, you might have your own thoughts, the listeners might have their own thoughts on this, but 5 or 6 years of making a bunch of mistakes and doing it wrong and refining and reading and learning and improving, then I think we can say, we're becoming pretty solid as a teacher. So then we have to ask the question, what does that mean for an individual who finds themselves promoted into middle leadership after maybe just 2 or 3 years of kind of normal classroom teaching? That's something that is always worth considering, because as we might talk about later, I think when you move into a middle leadership role, it's quite possible that your own classroom teaching suffers as a result due to the demands of the job and other pressures. And it's something that I'll mention again, I think, but I'll mention now because it is that important. You don't want to let your own teaching become deprioritized. We need to find ways of keeping the standards high. And I was fortunate enough in my journey to go on a few sort of training courses, have some experience of middle leadership, understand what that role involves. I learned much more when I was on the job than when I was on the training courses, which I think is often the case in schools. But, I think in a lot of cases, we might find that our middle leaders have had an afternoon or a twilight, and then they're in the job. And to some extent, we're relying on some sort of intuition about what it means to be a good leader. And the truth is, not everybody has that in them, or at least that doesn't come easily for everybody. So middle leaders, a critical role within the school, and a difficult role to get right.
I saw someone have a conversation about how they felt the quality of their teaching was in decline since taking on like a head of maths role. I can't remember exactly the conversation, but yeah, that definitely echoes what I've seen, the conversations I've seen people having. And quite typically, it'll be the work that you have to do in the evening time because you've, like you say, you've just got your classroom stuff sorted. You've probably got plans and things that you can tweak. You don't need to do the whole, I'm an early career teacher and I'm planning everything from scratch and I'm thinking carefully about every single thing. And then you get this mid leadership stuff. I mean, for me, 5 years and you're probably just about efficient. Well, certainly in my case, I was just about efficient. And then it was probably after 10 years that, some sort of level of, I don't know, I don't want to say excellence. I don't want to blow my own trumpet too much, but we're talking finished products pretty close right here. I'm joking. Yeah, so I think that's really important. Now, middle leadership, there are lots of different titles floating about in education at the moment because possibly because of the academization process and sort of large trusts have more flexibility with how they or maybe they need different roles for terms and conditions of contracts and things. Are we talking about any sort of limiting factors when it comes to the amount of decision making power you have? Like, is a middle leader someone who has to ultimately get sign off from someone in the senior leadership team? Whereas in the senior leadership, you've probably got some decision making power and just need head teacher sign off. Is it worth thinking about things in those terms, just in case anyone is, I don't know, doesn't have a title that they would, we would, inverted commas, typically find in education?
That's a really interesting point that you make, and I can only think that the answer to that is that it depends. It depends a lot on context. If you're fortunate enough to be in a school or an institution where you're trusted, then and you're valued for your expertise, because middle leaders are people that bring a very specific set of skills and knowledge to the bigger school framework. So if you're valued and you're trusted, then yes, you'll find that you do have some more freedom. And I think ultimately you probably are looking for sign off from somebody above, but you're also in a position where you can influence those above you. And I've been fortunate in my career to be able to work closely with SLT and to have that trust and to be able to have those really good conversations that see middle leaders influencing the general direction of the school or the school group. But there are definitely other situations where people are not so fortunate, and it may well feel that your hands are tied. But the reality is that you can lead from anywhere. Actually, you can be a classroom teacher at the chalk face, and you're still a leader because you interact with other colleagues and you influence, and the way you behave will have an impact, and that is a form of leadership. So, to answer your question, it is varied. It's difficult in that we don't know the exact context, but proving your worth is a good way of opening more doorways for your own thinking. And I'm not going to necessarily say we should just be pushing our own agenda, but you will have a strong set of beliefs and values, and hopefully you'll be knowledgeable enough to know what actually does work in the classroom, and then to be able to take those things, present those things to leadership, and have a really positive influence on the decision making further up the school.
Yeah, I think that's key. When I work quite a lot with schools who are establishing the systems for almost later success or sustained success or sustained improvement. And the first thing we start with is you need head teacher buy-in, you need the support of your senior leaders, but your responsibility is to have a vision that you can articulate clearly, because it also, it's just like planning a lesson. You start with where you want to get to, and then you work back, because then you can see where things might go wrong. Lloyd calls it, I think he mentioned in the podcast, calls it a pre-mortem. Now, I don't like that term. It sounds a bit, from the crypt for me, but it's a really, it's basically looking for misconceptions that in your planning, but on a school-wide level. And it's not misconceptions, it's opportunities for things to go wrong. So I think, context specific, so people will know whether or not they're a middle leader, based on their own context, as opposed to any sort of clear definition from us. Now, we've started to bridge into this a little bit. Why is middle leadership so important?
Obviously I've had almost 2 decades working in schools and with schools, and everybody in a school contributes in some way, and the role is important. But for me, middle leadership is quite unique in the way that it's positioned. It's right at the centre of the kind of the busy day-to-dayness of school life, and by that, I mean middle leaders are still classroom teachers. You're in touch with students, and you're in touch with parents. So immediately you're reaching out across those 2 different aspects of school life. But, you're also responsible for a group of teachers who are within your department or on your team, and you will be working across other middle leaders, across the school with other middle leaders. And then, of course, working up the way with senior leadership and the head teacher. So, I don't really see any other role within a school structure that is so centralised and that reaches out in such a sort of regular way to all the various elements that contribute. I also think that middle leadership is really important because the middle leaders should be the most knowledgeable in terms of curriculum, assessment, teaching and learning approaches. And in that way, a group of middle leaders who are on their game, who know their business, become this sort of furnace. It's like burning away at the heart of the school with ideas and with knowledge, and that furnace should be powering the school in terms of its direction. We don't always have to look to the very, very top of the leadership structure to say that's where all the ideas come from, and then everybody underneath just is there as a sort of foot soldier to execute them. In fact, it should really be the opposite. You want to build a team with people who are knowledgeable and talented, and then get them to help manage up and drive the ideas up. And that's also true for your own math team. You don't need to be the one that knows everything. Middle leaders don't need to have all the answers. Sometimes you have to pretend that you have all the answers, but it's absolutely okay to lean on colleagues and draw on expertise and take ideas from other people. In fact, something that I'm going to say now, because I'll forget to say it later, is that when somebody on your team does challenge you, asks a difficult question, something maybe you haven't considered, don't make the mistake that I've made throughout most of my career in giving an immediate response. You don't have to immediately have a response or the right response or an answer. Just say, look, you know what, that's a really valuable comment. I want to spend a bit of time thinking it through, the right answer for this, and we're going to come back and we're going to revisit that and we're going to go thoroughly through this so we get the best solution. So don't feel you have to just immediately be able to throw out answers to everybody's problems off the cuff. Now, I sort of drifted a little bit away from what you'd asked there about why middle leadership is so important, but the other reasons there, I think, are that we're a bridge, between classroom teachers, the members of your team, and senior leadership. And this can be a bridge that takes quite a heavy burden and quite a heavy load at times because, let's be honest, there'll be times when members of your team are struggling with pressures, there'll be deadlines, there'll be work to do, and they're pushing back, saying to you, like, I'm awfully busy, how am I going to fit this in, how can I make this work? And above you, you've got initiatives and ideas coming from SLT that somehow you're squashed in the middle. And you will inevitably find yourself in that position, but it is important that we find ways and systems of dealing with that. We want to be an advocate for our team. We want to push back when it's appropriate to SLT and say this is unreasonable, we can't get this done. And similarly, we also need to help communicate and explain to colleagues why the school is moving in the direction it's moving, because there'll be some bigger motivational factors and reasons behind what the school's trying to do and initiatives that are trying to be brought in. And middle leaders can contribute significantly to student outcomes. This is the reason why I took a post of head of department. It was a member of the SLT at the time who was a mentor to me, and she said, look, Stuart, you currently teach about 100 kids roughly across your classes, and you're having a really positive impact on those kids. But if you step up to head of department, that's 700 kids in this school that you're going to be working with and that you're going to be able to influence the development of their learning. And that was the big reason for me to say, well, I want to step up to middle leadership because I want to have a wider impact. So middle leader is really important because you set those standards, you set those high expectations, and then also provide support to colleagues to get them there. And I think I said already that, also middle leaders can influence that overall vision of the school. But the critical bit of middle leadership is not just saying, okay, we're all doing, initiative X. Now, we've got to say, this is how we're going to do it, practical strategies and ways of implementing it. And then we need to look at those, review those, refine those, improve on those, and continue pushing. And so again, middle leadership there, it's not just about pulling out ideas, it's about executing and making them actually work, critical to the running of a successful school.
So we've got a furnace, a bridge. I'm about to say they're going to grease the wheels. Essentially they're making things, the cogs turn in the school. So who knows how many more metaphors we can get through within this. But I think you're absolutely spot on. And I think, it just shows how important middle leadership is. Really, nothing's going to get done if leadership from the middle isn't effective. And as you said at the start, it's not something we're trained in. I think lots more people are going on like those middle leader professional qualifications now than when I was starting out. I'm not even sure if it existed. But I know that people are going on, there's almost a lot more consistency in terms of expectations, and that message is getting to people from quite early on in their careers, because then it's the same message that's coming through in the senior leadership and the head teacher qualifications. It's slow and steady wins the race. Let's be really deliberate about what we do. What are your guiding principles for leading from the middle?
I think that there's a whole range of things that we want to consider if we're going to be effective in this role, if we're going to be effective at leading from the middle. And some of these are kind of high level sort of thinking about the overall structure, the overall vision, the direction of the department and also the school. And others are more specific. So I think I'll try and give you just a general sense just now of some of these kind of principles. And for me, I think it boils down to, an aim. You want to set an aim. What is it that you're actually trying to achieve in this mathematics department or with this group of mathematics teachers in the school? What do we want to do for the students? And so I think it's really important that either collaboratively or you do this yourself and then take it to the team, that we set an aim and that we know why we've chosen this as our aim. Because if we don't know why we're doing it, then who's going to subscribe to that and why should we bother? So there needs to be a really sort of clear kind of rationale that wins over, and that not only wins over but really appeals to the hearts and the minds of everybody on your team. So set an aim is critical, know why it's your aim, and then develop a set of key objectives that are designed to meet that aim. And then I think anything that you do should fulfill those objectives and therefore be pushing you toward your aim. Because if not, if things that we're doing in the department, in the classrooms across the school, that don't fulfill those objectives, then they're probably not taking us towards our aim. And so they're either the wrong thing or our objectives need to change. So I think setting an aim and knowing why it's your aim and having some structured objectives to work toward that aim are critical.
Where do we get our aims from? Because I quite often have the conversation, where do I go for inspiration? How do I know what good quality mathematics teaching or just teaching in general looks like? Where does that come from? Because obviously if you're engaged in reading about our craft, if you're reading about education, research, these things start to tick over. But how do I land on this is what my ideal is for maths, this is what my ideal is for the quality of teaching? Is it something that develops over time, or can we take deliberate steps? Okay, I'm a novice middle leader. I need to know more. I want to find my own vision. What do I do?
You might find that your aim could change over time as the department moves from one stage to the next, depending on the personnel and depending on where it's at just now. But like I said before, I think the aim should be something that's quite high level. And so without getting into the real specifics of what are those objectives and what does highly effective teaching look like, the aim is going to be something like, provide the highest quality educational experience that we can so that all students are able to achieve success in school mathematics, for example. And the reason that we're doing that, the why of that, is because we owe it to them. It is our role in society to help the next generation be equipped in the best way that we possibly can for life beyond school, for work and for life in general. So that when I'm talking about aim, I'm talking about something as kind of high level as that, which I think anyone can probably subscribe to. The objectives will be harder depending on your level of knowledge and expertise, and then actually the real nuts and bolts about what are we doing in the department to meet these objectives or to push us towards these objectives, again, we can probably touch upon a little bit later. One thing that crossed my mind when you mentioned that was reasonably recently I've been talking about curriculum, and as part of that I did some research into various different curricula in the UK and beyond. And whenever you find a curriculum document produced by an education department or whoever it is, they basically are all the same. They all start with the same sort of spiel, which is about encouraging, or not even encouraging, a curriculum that supports young people in becoming confident with mathematics and enjoying mathematics, and being able to make decisions that are going to allow them to live a better and sort of more successful life. So almost every curriculum that you read about has that sort of aspirational aim. And that is a source of inspiration for us as well. But what's really kind of interesting is what is sometimes missing is the how. So there's the aim, and we kind of get the why, but where's the how? What comes after in most curricula is a list of bits of maths that need to be taught, and there's maybe some little disconnect. So I don't know. That's just my take. And that's something that middle leaders need to think about with their teams is, how are we actually achieving those aims?
A very polite way of saying you've misinterpreted what I said, Kieran. So I appreciate your kindness.
Another guiding principle for middle leaders is to do with time. And I think that, sometimes I put this last when I'm talking about effective middle leadership, but it's probably the most important thing, is that we understand that there will always be more work to do. And you don't have to do it all. What we want to do is we want to make sure we focus the available time that we have, the limited time that we have, on the tasks, the initiatives, the actions that are going to make the most impact, i.e. the things that will help us fulfill those objectives that I talked about earlier on. So we've got this clear structure, and the things that we're spending our time on, we need to continually ask ourselves, is this helping me fulfill an objective that I've set for the department? So for me, objectives might be improved teacher efficacy. And then if I'm sitting sort of spending hours and hours writing emails to parents or whatever that might be, is that improving teacher efficacy? So yeah, there's admin to do, but we want to think about how we're spending our time. So time is limited. There'll always be more work. So focus on the things that matter. It's okay not to do everything. The school will open the next day, children will arrive, and they'll have learned something and they'll learn more the next day. Remember that nobody performs well when stressed for extended periods of time. Humans are not designed to be stressed for extended periods. Our bodies can cope with momentarily being stressed, and we respond, and we need to calm down again. It is no good to be exhausted. You're no good to anybody. You've got a finite amount of time and energy, so use it to work on the things that support the aim.
Sometimes our goals or objectives for whatever subject we're leading can be tied to our accountability processes. I mean, more often than not, probably. And then there's also the phenomenon of the sunk cost fallacy. How easy did you find it to discard ineffective practices, particularly in keeping in mind that admission that things aren't working might then have a negative impact on your, performance review or whatever it is that happens every year?
To be honest, I think that I didn't find it too difficult to discard things that aren't working, which might sound strange. I appreciate the sunk cost fallacy. We've spent a lot of time creating this thing. We've put a lot of effort into making this. We've been running this initiative for a certain amount of time. why stop? Keep going. We spent all this effort in it. But when things aren't working, people know things aren't working. That's coming to you in the form of feedback from students, from parents, from other teachers and colleagues, or from SLT, or even if you just picked up on that yourself. If it's not working, it's not working. So we should be open and honest and address that, because that type of climate or that culture is very healthy. If people are able to sort of discuss how successful things are being and actually be able to take that step back and say, well, okay, are there alternatives? When is the time to seriously consider switching to an alternative? That's a disposition that learning mathematics teaches you, is when you're faced with a problem and you're trying to solve it using one approach. Somewhere down the line, if that's not the correct approach, you have to stop, you have to back up, and you have to think about an alternative approach. And so, your point about sort of performance review and appraisals and things like that is valid. But for me, I would hold in much higher regard an individual who was able to stop and say, we thought this would work, we tried this. We then had measures in place that gave us the feedback to say it wasn't working as we expected. We reviewed, we refined, it still didn't work. So we took it right back to the drawing board and we've gone with this instead. And for me, that's the person I want on my team.
I mean, you're getting the full Paxman treatment. I apologize that it's gone fully news night. But I know that whenever Kate and I talk about something and, it's on a school improvement thing and think, well, we've got too much to do, I find it really easy to make a list of things and go, we can cut this. And she doesn't necessarily. And so it makes me think that maybe there are lots of people who are thinking, this isn't an easy process. So it's worth thinking, I think you're very clear in terms of how you might go about it. But I thought it was worth asking, so it's special privileges because we talk every day. You're getting the harshest treatment,
I appreciate it. No, I do. And I'm looking forward to this 5-hour episode when it gets released.
Well, Johnny and Dave would be very disappointed if it was anything less than 5 hours, wouldn't they?
I don't want to let them down. I was talking there about time, but another sort of way of viewing time is through efficiency. And we know that maths teams, maths departments have limited time together. And so I think it's really, really important to make the most of that time. We want to make sure that we are aiming for consistently high standards of teaching across the whole of the team. And to do that, we need to make sure that departmental meetings are efficient and that they're focused on doing exactly that. We want to make sure that we are using as much of the available time that we have together to improve teacher efficacy and not to be dealing with sort of tedious admin that can be done in a different way. I also think it's really important when we're talking about efficiency is to look at the use of our own time and consider how we are using our limited free time. And I say free time, but there isn't any free time in a school really, but non-contact time, how we're using that to, again, try and meet the aim and try and fulfill the objectives that are going to take us to the aim. And for me, a big part of that is supporting colleagues in improving. And then I think a final guiding principle for just now is to do with expectations. And this is interesting because it just directly mirrors what you do with the class. When you're working with a group of pupils, there's a process of expectation setting, and it's key as a teacher, and especially when I work with early career teachers or teachers who are maybe sort of more novice. They maybe have in their head what they think is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. Sometimes they haven't even got as far as really being clear in their own mind what it is that we want to set in terms of expectations. Never mind how are we going to try and ensure that they're met, and what is the result if they're not met. So I think really important that middle leaders develop their own sense of what expectations are in terms of teaching and in terms of learning, in terms of professional development, and that these are communicated very clearly to the team. We want to be very clear in what we expect to see in lessons. Maybe we can explore later on this idea of should we have non-negotiables? Should middle leaders insist on certain things to take place in lessons? I know that will be causing the hair on the back of some people's necks to rise at the moment. But I think I can form an argument as to why some things, should be considered to be non-negotiable. And we need to also know, in sort of under that heading of expectations, we need to also know where our thoughts and where our thinking sits on the sort of scale of the scale between giving teachers full autonomy to just go and do their thing and be great, and ensuring consistency in terms of the high standards of teaching and learning. And the extreme end of that is the centralized PowerPoint and making every teacher has to click through the same slides and use the same set of prescribed tasks. So there's decisions to be made in there, and then there's expectations to be communicated. So I think those are probably the guiding principles that I see as most important. Have an aim, set an aim, work towards that aim, think about your time, focus on doing the things that make the biggest impact and that take you toward your objectives. Be efficient in the sense of make the most of your time with colleagues, try and focus on improving departmental meetings, and then expectations, be clear in your own mind and communicate to colleagues the expectations that you have in terms of what you want to see in lessons, what we do in this department, and where you sort of sit on this scale, this tricky scale between consistency and full autonomy.
Are you going to mention non-negotiables later on, or can we get into it now? Because whenever I heard that, I was like, In my experience, maybe it could just be a terminology thing. Non-negotiables, to me, more often than not, seems like a proxy for poor leadership, in as much as there's not really an understanding of the fact that maths lessons will differ depending on where you are in a sequence. And we've talked about before the lesson not being the unit of measurement, and the idea that when I'm doing, if I'm doing a lot of instruction today, it might be tomorrow that I ask pupils to practice. We just pick up where we left off. Non-negotiables are quite often, I want to see this in every lesson, and I want to see this every day. And when I walk into classes, I want to see this, rather than here are the things we think feature in effective teaching. If I don't see it today, well, maybe I'll see it down the line, and it's a bigger picture kind of thing. Because I know where you're coming from. You want to hear the practices we think are informed by evidence and have the best chance of supporting people's learning. What's your argument for non-negotiables? Because that's my interpretation of that, and maybe it is that we just need a different name for it.
Yeah, my interpretation lines up with what you've described there. So you could be right in the sense that it's just a sort of naming convention in here. There are things that I need to see over a period of time, that teachers need to be doing over a period of time. So going into a lesson with a clipboard and a checklist is not at all what I'm encouraging here in any way. But there certainly are things that I feel do have a place in not necessarily every single lesson, but the very, very large majority of lessons should feature certain elements. I know that we've discussed like a mathematical idea not fitting neatly into a 50-minute lesson or whatever that is, and that lesson 2 may well just pick up on where lesson 1 was. So the whole idea of 5 a day and everybody has to do a starter or a retrieval starter with 4 quarters or whatever, and that's whole school policy. And I know that happens. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. And I think when we do dig into non-negotiables or minimum expectations, I don't know, maybe that's a better term. We'll dig into that a little bit more later on. Hopefully that'll become clearer.
Yeah, so no scrap, unfortunately. I'm just waiting for that big tete-a-tete that'll make the podcast really break through. But unfortunately, this time it was not to be, because it was a very it is just the term non-negotiable, because people have interpreted it and then been really, every lesson must have 3 parts, every lesson must, which is seemingly what we do in education. We take things very, very literally, but hopefully not if we spend time thinking. So what does this look like in practice?
Okay, so I've talked for quite a while now about setting an aim. I think it's really critical. So we do that, either we suggest aims, but ideally we do this collaboratively with the department and we iterate down towards some sort of aim. So an example of an aim that I think works well for me is This department aims to improve mathematical outcomes for all pupils because we owe it to our pupils to give them the best possible chances and the widest possible range of options as they move on to life beyond school. So what we've got in there is what we're trying to do, improve the outcomes for pupils, and the reason why, because we want them to go on and have a successful life. Then, and we can do this collaboratively with the department, is come up with a set of objectives that support the team in achieving that aim. And so an example of 3 objectives here, I mentioned one earlier on, was improve teacher efficacy. I think that we know that the single biggest thing that we can do to make a difference to student outcomes is to make our teachers better. And I'm not saying our teachers are bad, but we can all improve. And so improving teacher efficacy, I think, has got to be sort of number 1 objective for me. A second objective that might take us toward that same aim is to create a departmental culture of sort of collaboration, but also challenge. So we want to consistently be pushing people to be better, not threatening or low threat, but certainly plenty of challenge and plenty of support, and that support can come through collaboration. And then a third objective for me would be to, and this is to do with the pupils, because we mustn't forget that they're a huge factor in the success of the school and in their own success. So I think it's important to set and insist upon high expectations of pupils in terms of their effort, in terms of their participation, in terms of their behaviour, and in terms of the quality of their work. So those are 3 objectives: improve teacher efficacy, create a departmental culture of challenge and collaboration, and then the third one there is set those high expectations for students in terms of their effort and their participation. And then I think if we view everything that we do from then on through the lens of those objectives and keep asking the question, is this thing that we're doing just now, is it helping us meet those objectives? Because if not, we need to ask ourselves, why are we doing it? The second guiding principle I talked about was time. And, I'm sure we've encountered the Pareto principle, that 80-20 rule, which states that roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the inputs. And so really good leaders, are able to identify those tasks that contribute to the bigger gain. And so we want to try and focus on identifying and doing just a few high impact tasks really well. Now, I talked about time. I talked about middle leaders having limited non-contact time. And quite often when I do talk with middle leaders, I ask them to tell me how many lessons they're not teaching. And sometimes it's really quite frightening how few free lessons or available lessons there are. And then I like to ask them to sort of split that time up or report to me on how that time is split across 3 things. And if you're listening just now, you can maybe even consider this if you're in this role. How much of your time, what proportion is spent on preparing your own lessons and doing marking? What proportion is spent on your head of department and wider school admin? And then the third thing is what proportion is spent dropping into lessons or scheduling time and having chats with colleagues about their teaching? So you're just thinking about your available time, which might be 5 or 6 free lessons a week. It might be less than that. How much is spent preparing for your own lessons? How much is spent on wider school admin? And how much is spent dropping in to lessons and supporting colleagues and chatting to colleagues about their teaching? And it's probably no surprise that most people's time is just sucked up with admin, and that preparing their own lessons gets a small proportion of the available time. Somebody once talked to me about the 7-step lesson plan. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Kieran, but it's the 7 steps from the departmental base to the classroom as you just make up what you're going to teach on the hoof, which I did for years. And it wasn't great, to be honest, you get through. But it goes back to what I said before, don't let your own teaching slip. And very little of head of department and middle leaders' time is spent in lessons or scheduling time to chat with colleagues about their teaching. Now, this is not to say that it doesn't happen. I've been in schools where sort of forward-thinking senior leadership and head teachers have added more time into middle leaders' schedules, have given them more time specifically for the purpose of catching up with another teacher, doing a bit of lesson visits, learning walks or lesson observations. I don't like that phrase, but that it does happen. But I do feel in the majority of cases, it's not really the case. What I want to see is of the 100% available time, 25% spent preparing your own lessons, 25% spent on your head of department and wider school admin, and 50% of your available free time spent getting into lessons or scheduling time to chat with colleagues about their teaching. And when I say that to a room of middle leaders, you can see the expressions. That's not possible. How are we going to do that? At least aspire to that. Keep the main thing the main thing. And what's really important about your role is improving teacher efficacy. That's one of our objectives, and that feeds into our aim. So we need to make sure that we prioritize it. So 50% of your available time getting into lessons or having a conversation with a teacher in your department about their teaching, and then 25% preparing for lessons, 25% on wider scale admin. Like there are admin duties that you can do really, really quickly. You don't need to spend absolutely ages crafting beautiful emails. You have to be a bit blunt, you have to be efficient and just brush some things off as quickly as you can. And even marking. So I'm not a massive fan of marking. I would just say don't do it, to be honest. There's going to be times when you can mark in lessons, get students to mark their own stuff, giving feedback, try and do that whole class, be efficient, don't spend copious hours writing feedback on student notebooks when they're probably not going to read it and they're probably not going to do anything about it. So try and be really lean and efficient. And then that leaves you with that time to get into lessons and chat with colleagues.
Knowing how much you love administration, I'm surprised at how little it features, but I think it's a very sensible way to divvy up your time. I mean, when I was in a school that had Microsoft Office, I used to get a digest every week about how I'd spent my time. And I can't remember if I was populating my calendar and then assigning different types of, role or event to the tasks. And so maybe a little bit more input in terms of I'm putting in that I'm doing my data management here or I'm doing my learning walks here. But over time, that started to give me a picture of how I spent my time. So if anyone's using that, maybe worth looking into because it can help us see the big picture. I know lots of banking apps try to help us see how we're spending our money because these things are happening every day and we don't have that big picture sense of how we're behaving. So I think, worth checking out because I think, it very much is a case of prioritizing that which is going to have the biggest impact. And I think you're absolutely right. It's spending time in class with teachers. And even if you can't spend 50%, if you just say, well, that's not possible, you're not going to spend any time in there, are you?
So one of the other guiding principles I mentioned was being efficient. And if we think about how that might sort of happen in practice, we're again looking at the department, we're thinking about time and the way we're using that time. And one thing to consider is how frequently as a department do you meet? How often do you get together with your maths teaching colleagues, whatever your context is? I've already sort of talked there about spending time with colleagues individually using your own free time, but what about departmental meetings? Don't forget that your department is probably the widest mixed ability class you will have, with different personalities, different backgrounds, different levels of expertise, different numbers of years of experience. And there's one thing that we all have in common, and that is that we're all interested in teaching mathematics, and we're all keen on seeing students achieve well in mathematics. So we want to use that common ground when we're together to build a sort of a culture and an ethos of collaboration, and we're all working towards something. And make a point of showing that you welcome input from everyone. So as I've described there, people at different stages in their career will all have valid input to make. And I don't think I've ever sort of spoken this publicly, but certainly in my role as head of department, I had one colleague who, at the time, I felt was very sort of traditional and very sort of stuck in their ways. And it's only on reflecting back now that I realised that so much of what was going on in that classroom was really, really highly effective. Just because it wasn't all bells and whistles and the latest sort of initiative, it didn't mean that it wasn't effective. And it's really important to remember that input from everyone is valued, even if it doesn't align with what you're currently thinking. Because as I said earlier, you don't have to know everything. You don't know everything, and at some point you may well be wrong. So, as I say, you get this mixed ability kind of group, and you want to try and use colleagues as resources to learn from one another, pairing sort of experts with non-experts. And those groupings might change depending on what the focus is for the department. Something that you've got to try and do to improve efficiency is reduce time spent on admin in departmental meetings. I know that it's been said by many people now, but don't have it in a departmental meeting if it can be sent by email. Consider a weekly bulletin even, and this is leading sort of back to my love of admin, is a sort of Sunday night put together the week ahead type of document, and that's things like dates of exams and names of people who are taking the kids to the maths challenge or whatever it is. That sort of stuff doesn't need to be discussed in a departmental meeting. Prepare, circulate agenda in advance. Give people the opportunity to contribute, but then draw a line, because what we can't have is departmental meetings being derailed by AOB that just sort of pops up and then takes 45 minutes to discuss. To be honest, I'm not even sure that AOB should exist. If it's important, it gets on the agenda. And if it's just thrown in because somebody's popped into somebody's head, then maybe chat about it later and raise it at a later meeting. Try and frame each agenda item as a question. Now, I've done this for a number of years, and it kind of works, because if you're together as a department, then to show that you value the knowledge in the room, ask people what they think. And if you can phrase the agenda items as questions, then that's immediately encouraging discussion rather than a sort of statement. If you can't frame it as a question, it's probably just admin. It's probably just a decree. So, don't include it. If there's no way of avoiding admin, and it might be for whatever reason that there's some information that needs to be communicated to the department from SLT, whatever it is, stick it at the end. Don't have it at the beginning. Just have 10 minutes at the end for admin, and then you save by the bell, so to speak. You get through as much as you can, and then it'll work. It'll be fine. If you don't get through all of it, you'll communicate it in some way. Any tasks that arise should be clearly defined, and I spent pretty much my entire time as head of department getting this wrong, but eventually I think I got it toward the end. You must make sure that if somebody's taking the responsibility of doing a task or doing a job, that they understand clearly what that is. It doesn't necessarily mean that has to take up time in the departmental meeting, thrashing that out, the exact intricacies of the task. Maybe you've done that in advance, or maybe you do that together later, but they should be clearly defined. They should be time bound. So by next week, we need to have whatever it is, and it needs to be allocated to somebody, either an individual or pairs. I think you want to encourage colleagues to contribute and to lead parts of your departmental meeting. And I've been mentoring a few heads of department who have already sort of brought this in. And it's nice. You don't need to sit under the spotlight throughout an entire departmental meeting. Shift that spotlight to your colleagues. That all contributes to that second objective that I mentioned there, trying to create that culture of challenge and collaboration. And there was a hashtag that was going around for a while. It might still do, the hashtag maths rocked this week. And I quite like this approach of saying to colleagues, okay, I want each of you to come to the meeting and be ready to respond to that and tell me, why did maths rock this week in your class? What was it that you did? And I have to be honest, if on a weekly basis colleagues can't come with one decent thing to say that happened in the classroom, then they need to think a little bit harder about what they're doing. Although I maybe wouldn't phrase it quite like that, but we should be able to always come up with something. And you don't need to pick everybody, maybe just hear from a couple of people, and then there you're sharing ideas and you're keeping the conversation about the main thing, which for me is teaching and learning. I also think it's important in departmental meetings to ring fence some time for teaching conversations and maybe working through some tasks. And this sort of links to this idea of consistency versus autonomy. Because if you let teachers just do their own thing, then some of them will be using great tasks and others won't. And I think it's really important that all colleagues get exposed to great tasks, but then also how to use those tasks, because we know fine well that a task is really only as good as it's used in the classroom by the teacher. So one way of doing that is to pick a topic that's coming up in the curriculum that most teachers are teaching soon, or that all teachers have experience of teaching at some point, and then find a good task. And maybe that somebody in your department can contribute that task. and just do the maths and just work that task, and then ask colleagues like, how would you sort of modify this task if somebody was really struggling to access it? How can we lower the floor? What scaffolding can we put around? What questioning might we use to prompt them? And then also, what about a pupil that's finished? What sort of probing questions might we be able to ask? How might we be able to really test that understanding? And then what that means is that the whole department now have got a task that not only can they go and like download from the shared area, which is a common thing that the departments have, but they've actually worked that task together. They've thought about the intricacies of it, and they'll be much better placed to go and use it more effectively in the classroom. So ring fence some time to do tasks with pupils, because then all teachers will have that new task at their disposal.
So, I mean, obviously you're using the language of your experience, talking about departmental meetings and things like that there. And although perhaps sometimes less frequent in primary, the principles still stand. This is a good way to use your time, what time you do have.
So the final sort of guiding principle that we touched on earlier, that I was going to elaborate on now, was this idea of sort of expectations. I'm not going to go into the features of highly effective teaching and learning just now, I don't think, because that's possibly a whole other episode. But I am going to go back to this idea of sort of minimum expectations or non-negotiables, which I think we probably, the language there is quite important. Non-negotiables almost feels threatening to some colleagues. So minimum expectations, and I'm quite happy to take abuse for these, but I think that almost every lesson should include some element of recap. And I don't think many people would disagree, even if it's a continuation of what we were working on last lesson or in last math period. It's got to have some form of recap. Remember yesterday we were doing this, what did that tell us? Well, just to grease those wheels and get the sort of activate that prior knowledge. I also think that if students are practicing, then they need to know if they've had success or not. So answers need to be made available. Now, there's all sorts of different ways of doing that, whether it's students marking their own work, swapping and marking each other's, which I think is a waste of time. But there's loads of different ways of doing it. Teachers may be just revealing answers on the board. But far too often I see students working up to the end of a lesson. Teacher realises it's 30 seconds till the end of the maths period, and then the answers are displayed. Some students manage to mark what they've done, some don't. But there's no follow-up, there's no follow-through. Is it all correct? Well, that's great, but invariably it's not. So what about the ones that are wrong? That's why I think marking should happen periodically throughout the lesson. So we do a bit of practice, then everybody stops. We say, okay, I can see everyone's now done question 1, for example. So let's stop and let's all mark our work up to this point and then carry on with the practice. What that does is it gives the teacher the opportunity to then go round to the students who had made some mistakes and give some corrective instructions, clarify and pick out any misconceptions, etc. So I think that's really important. I want to see students knowing that they've been successful or not. What about some form of periodic mixed review? So this is not going to be every lesson, but at some point I want to see groups of students looking back over work they've done, not just last week, last month, etc., but just to keep that mixed review going. Some sort of interleaved practice. So where it comes to strategy selection, there's no point doing 20 questions that all require exactly the same procedure to solve them, because students are not daft. They understand that today's lesson was about Pythagoras, and every single question today is going to require Pythagoras. You want to drop in different questions there to try and force the students to engage in method selection, which we know they find difficult. Independent practice, I touched on it earlier. Every lesson, almost, I always add that caveat, but almost every lesson should have some sort of independent practice. I think there's nothing wrong with 10 or 15 minutes of everyone's quiet and everybody's practicing to build up that fluency, to build up that automaticity with those kind of key skills before we go a bit deeper into maybe more sort of problems that are more applied or contextualized. There's actually nothing wrong with periodically having a lesson where nothing new is introduced at all. Nothing new at all, and just a lesson of mixed practice of things that you've done recently. I want to see teachers continually circulating the room. Once it comes to free practice, we need to be around there, having a look at what the students are doing and checking in on their understanding by asking them, maybe questioning them in a way that tests their understanding of what they're doing. And that can be done in small groups, or it can be done in individuals. And then I want to see teachers at the end of a lesson, end of a maths lesson, being able to identify the 2 or 3 students who struggled the most with today's new idea. And in some cases, that might be the same students, but quite often we'll find that it's not, and that different students take to different kind of ideas in maths better than others. And so I want teachers to be able to say at the end of the lesson, those 3 I know found that pretty challenging today, and next lesson I'm going to make a point of just pulling them together, or I'm going to get them in at lunchtime or a break, or whatever the response is. But I want teachers to know that. Now, as a middle leader, if you spend, or at least aspire to spend, 50% of your non-contact time in classes, then you'll be able to talk about all of that, and you'll be able to have a sense of how much is going on. These expectations are mine, and I'm not saying that they need to take place in every single lesson. And I definitely don't want to see checklists and teachers being sort of graded on any of that stuff. That is an absolute no-no for me. But you can get a sense of what's going on in the room. So think about what you value, and then consider, what do I want to see in most, if not all, but certainly in most lessons. And that actually leads on to this consistency versus autonomy thing that I touched on earlier. Because the less expert teachers in your department, they need to see good tasks. If you're spending 50% of your time visiting lessons, you'll know the teachers that are using good tasks and that are using them really well. So capitalize on that expertise and then share it at departmental meetings. Less expert teachers also need to understand decision-making process. So you might find that a highly skilled teacher goes through a really carefully selected sequence of examples with a group, and that actually decides to do a few more examples of one particular type, because the group is, the information there is that they're not, it's not making sense, or they're not getting to grips with it as easily. So decisions will be made all the time, and less experienced teachers need to sort of see that. As I say, the best tasks quite often go into a sort of shared area, but we need to do a bit more than that. We need to make sure that teachers are getting a chance to use these tasks in action. For me, when we talk about consistency and autonomy, I'm not a subscriber to the centralized PowerPoint, unless your department is entirely made up of really, really novice teachers. There could be a time when, given the makeup of your department, you want to be that little bit tighter in terms of the resources that are being used. But for me, I'm not really a big fan of everybody uses the same. What I think we should focus on instead is the consistency of the pedagogy and the consistency of the elements that feature in lessons, rather than the actual physical resource, whether it's a slideshow or whether it's a very specific task.
I really like the way you've sort of tied in your expectations within how that impacts on the role of middle leader. I think it'd be really, really useful. We could have a few episodes on whether or not these need to feature in every lesson. Maybe that's one for the future. I was going to ask about challenges, but having looked at your notes, I think it'd be good to get a few middle leaders together and to hash out some of these challenges and how to respond to them. So we'll put a pin in that there, if that's okay with you, Stuart. I see, you've got some closing remarks. I think this is my section of the podcast. I don't know, you're getting a bit ahead of your station there, but in all seriousness, are there any final words of advice you would give to teachers or middle leaders listening to this?
I think that when I first assumed the responsibility as a middle leader, I thought I was a manager, and I haven't used that word at all today. We haven't used that word at all today, because it's very, very different. Managing is very, very different to leading. And I haven't talked about ordering the textbooks and managing the budget and making sure you've got the right number of calculators and all of those sort of administrative things. I haven't talked about performance review really, and maybe we can think that that's what managers do, but actually that's what leaders do. Everything that I've talked about is about leadership, and it's taken me, as I say, best part of 2 decades to get to this point. I thought I could write a book on leadership. I joke quite often now that it's more of a pamphlet than a book, and it actually only has 3 bullet points in it. But the things that really matter to me, the final sort of bits of advice I would give to a middle leader that I've amassed over my entire career is, number one, care for your colleagues. That is your job. The number one priority is to remember that these are people, they've got lives, they've got their own sort of difficulties and challenges and insecurities, and they're all different. But your role is to care for them first and foremost. And I think that even just having that as one guiding principle will serve you well. I think also you want to try and aim to get everybody in your team to the point where they can more or less do your job. That again is the role of a leader, is to nurture and encourage and develop those around them so that they can eventually exceed them. And I often say that to students in the maths class. I want you to be better at maths than me. And the students look horrified. Oh, how can we be better than the teacher? And the analogy is the boxing coach, perhaps, for an example. You know, they know the strategies, the techniques, the science of boxing, but they'll never be in the ring as a world champion. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to sort of be the boxing coach, and we're trying to create these world champions in the ring. So if you can try and aim to get everyone to the point where they can do your job, then you can just kick back, you can relax, and you can spend all that spare time thinking about the stuff that you find really, really interesting.
Perfect. I'm looking forward to the release of that 3 bullet point pamphlet. I think it'll be really useful for teachers. Who's going to publish it for you? I'll try and put you in contact with some people. It's been an absolute pleasure, Stuart. There's definitely more for this. This conversation has further to go. But I think for now, all that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
You're very welcome, Kieran. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.